Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to configure Azure AD as a SAML identity provider in AWS Cognito, and the protocol that we are going to use is SAML. And once that configuration is done, we are going to see how to log in using a user in Azure AD to a sample application that is integrated with Cognito. Before looking at the configuration, I will explain the end-to-end flow using this diagram so that it will be easier to understand how it works. So you can follow the sequence numbers, the step numbers in this diagram, and that will be really easy to understand. So in step number one, as you can see, when a user tries to access a client application, the client application will redirect to Cognito using OpenID Connect protocol. So basically, it's a browser redirect that happens in the step number two to Cognito. And depending on how Cognito is configured, Cognito will either show a login page where you need to click a button that will then initiate a SAML federation with Azure Active Directory. But if you have configured Cognito in a different way, it can also directly redirect the user's browser to Azure Active Directory's login page. So it entirely depends on how it is configured. So in the step number three, Cognito will post a SAML authentication request to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory will display the login page where the user needs to enter the credentials of the user profile that is configured in Azure Active Directory. That's what happens in step 4 and 5. And if the credentials are valid, then Azure Active Directory will post a SAML response back to Cognito in step number 7. And then Cognito will validate the SAML response using the public certificate, like verifying the signature, whether the SAML response is valid, all those things. And then it will create a profile or update a profile. Basically, when the user tries to log in for the very first time, it will create a profile in Cognito in step number 8. But if the user profile already exists, it will just update the user profile if there is any change in the attribute value like first name or last name or email address, those type of things. And in step number 9, Cognito will return an authorization code back to the client application. Uh, Again, this is a browser redirect. And client application has to use this authorization code to call the token endpoint in Amazon Cognito and get the ID and access tokens and a refresh token as well. So the step number 10 and 11 are actually backend API calls. So the step number 10 is the API call to Cognito, and then Cognito will return the tokens back to the client app. And the client application will then validate the ID token, the access token, and then if client application has any authorization logic to see if the user is supposed to access the application or not, depending on that, it will then allow the user to access the application in the browser. And that's what happens in the step number 12. So this is the end-to-end flow. And if you clearly understand this flow, then it is easy to understand the configuration as well. That's why I started with the diagram. And now let's get into the configuration screens. So as expected, I'm using the AWS Management Console where I will be using the Cognito service. And I'm going to use the Azure Active Directory service from Azure. So if you're not aware, you can create a developer account in Azure, and using that developer account, you can configure Azure Active Directory and then use that Azure Active Directory for all your proof of concepts. And I'm going to do all this configuration in Chrome browser and then use Mozilla browser for testing so that it will be easier to follow the end-to-end instructions. So let's first start with the AWS Cognito service. So I'm just going to create a basic user pool with default settings. So let's quickly go through these screens. So I'm going to use username and yeah, I can go to next. You can leave this as default. We don't need MFA for the POCs, so you can select no MFA. You can unselect these options. Go to next page. We don't really need a self-registration. So we will actually leave these things for now. We don't need any required attributes, but when we do the mapping of attributes at that point of time, we will take a look at it. So you can select this option just to skip this screen and then enter a user pool name. I'm just naming it as Azure AD UP1. I'm going to use Cognito hosted UI and use a Cognito domain. Let me copy this and try. Yeah, this domain is available. So we need to create a client during the configuration. So I'm going to just create a Azure AD client, generate a client secret. And as of now, I will just add jwt.io as the URL. And let's leave all these things as is. I'm going to add implicit grant as well. And let's unselect this for now. So let's use just implicit grant. But if you look at this warning, as you are aware, implicit grant is not secure. So please don't use it for any of your real applications that you're building. This is only for the purpose of understanding the end-to-end flow that I'm using implicit grant. But if you're building a production grade application, never use implicit grant. The recommended grant is authorization code flow or authorization code flow with Pixie. So this is only for the POC purpose, just for the understanding purpose, I'm using implicit grant. And let's remove this phone and use profile. So OpenID profile and email, and let's click next. So you can review all these configuration. If you want to make any changes, you can go ahead and do that. If you want to explore any other option like MFA, you are free to do that. So let's create the user pool. So the user pool got created and you can go to this app integration tab. You will see the domain that is configured and you will see the client that we created during the configuration. So the next step is to configure Azure AD as a SAML Identity Provider in this Cognito user pool. So in order to do that, let's first start with Azure Active Directory. So if you log into the portal.azure.com, you will see this kind of a screen. And if you have already configured Azure Active Directory in your developer Azure account, you will see the Azure Active Directory option and you can click view and go to the default directory view. And in order to configure a SAML service provider in Azure AD, so in this case, the SAML service provider is Cognito and the SAML identity provider is Azure AD. So in order to configure a SAML service provider, which is Cognito in this case, go to Enterprise Applications, create a new application and create your own application and select this option, which is integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery. So I'm just naming that application as Cognito SAML Client 1. It will take few seconds to create that application. Let's wait for that. Yeah, now the application is created. Let's go to this single sign-on screen and then you will see this SAML option. Click that SAML. So here you need to do all the configurations for the SAML service provider, which in this case is Cognito. So let's go step by step. So these two values are required, the entity ID and the reply URL, which is actually the assertion consumer service URL. So let's click edit, and we need to add the identifier for Cognito. So let's go to the Cognito documentation. So please note that Cognito has two different features, the user pool and identity pool. So when you search for Cognito SAML Identity Provider, the very first link that you see is the identity provider configuration for identity pool. But in this case, we are going to do it for the user pool and not the identity pool. So if you scroll down, you will see, you can go through this link later on, but I will just go through the key sections. So the assertion consumer service URL is actually this one, which is the user pool domain slash SAML2 slash IDP response. And the SAML identifier for Cognito is this particular format. So you can copy this, go back to the Azure screen, add this identity provider, this entity ID, and you need to replace this user pool ID. Go back to Cognito configuration screen and copy this user pool ID and replace it. And the next thing is the reply URL. Again, go back to the documentation. So we are using the Cognito domain. So copy this, go back to the screen. And now I need to replace this domain, region, all these values. So let's go to this app integration, copy this Cognito domain, go back to this Azure AD and replace this entire URL. You can leave all the other values as the default one and click save. So the SAML service provider is now configured. So you can see the remaining details. So there is one more thing that we need to do. We need to configure the attribute names and claims. So these are all the claims that will be sent, like email address, given name, name, and surname by default. Let's actually rename the claim names accordingly. So let's remove this namespace. We don't want this namespace. There is no harm in keeping the namespace. It's fine, but just for this, just for the simplicity of this, just to make it simple, right? I'm just removing it for now. So I have removed all these namespace. So now these are all the attributes that will be sent in the SAML assertion that is posted back to Cognito. That is basically in this diagram, it is the step number 7. So everything is configured. Now the next step is to add this Azure AD identity provider in Cognito. So let's use this metadata URL. Go back to the Cognito configuration screen, sign in experience, and add identity provider and select SAML and name it as Azure AD IDP. And I'm going to use the URL option here. And now we need to configure the attributes. So let's add an attribute. So first one is email, and this should map to the email address attribute that comes from Azure AD. The next one is given name. So this maps to the given name. And next one is family name. This maps to surname. And I think there should be a name attribute. Yes. And this maps to the name. So this identity provider is now configured. You can see the configuration here. And there is one more thing that I need to do. So if you go to this app integration tab, you will see this Azure AD client that I configured. And as of now, this Azure AD client supports only users from this particular Cognito user pool directory. That is basically only users who are configured in this Cognito user pool can access this application. So now we want to provide access to users from the Azure Active Directory to also access this application. So in order to do that, go to Edit and select the identity providers. So basically for this integration, we don't need this user pool. You can uncheck it or you can keep it. That's fine. As I mentioned, right, it's up to you. Like if you want this application to be accessed by users from this user pool as well as users from the Azure Active Directory, you can select both. Or if you want to allow only users from Azure Active Directory to access this application, you can unselect this user pool. But as of now, I will keep both. And I have selected the implicit grant option so that it is easy for testing this end-to-end integration. And if you look at the callback URL, I am using jwt.io. And if you're not aware of jwt.io, it is a very handy application like a website. So you can go to this jwt.io application, which is actually built by auth0, which is another identity provider similar to Cognito. And it is a very handy kind of a website page which you can use for testing these type of integrations, just for the initial testing before you actually integrate your client application with, say, an identity provider like Cognito or Auth0. Like your real client application will either be a Java or a .NET or a Node.js or any application or a Python application that you build, web application, and then you want to integrate that application with Cognito or Auth0 using OpenID Connect. There are multiple libraries that are available to do that, but this website that I'm using is only for the testing purpose, just to see how the end-to-end flow works. So let's go back to the Cognito configuration screen and save the changes. So now if you go back to the Azure Active Directory, users, so I already have a test user called OIDC test user. I just created it for a different integration. So I am going to use the same user. But if you want to create a new user, yeah, you can do that. It's just use this create user option. I will name it as SAML test user 1. Yeah, you need to refresh for the user to show up. And yeah, sometimes uh, it will take some time for what you say, like to even modify all the properties here. So let's actually wait for some time. So I need to actually I want to add the email address. So if I go to this edit and the email address, so let me use actually, I will use the same principal name as the email and save. So you can see the basic user details here. And since I didn't actually invite the user, right? I don't think there is any password that is set. So let me actually reset the password. So it gave me a temporary password which I can use during my first time login, and then it will ask for the actual password. So let's see how the flow works now. So there is one more thing that I need to do. Let me actually close this again. So if you remember, I configured this enterprise application, SAML application, Cognito SAML client 1, but I didn't assign that user to this application. If I don't assign the user to that application, then I won't be able to log in. Maybe what I will do is I will actually show both the options. So if you go back to, okay, let's leave it. Actually, I will add the user now. Basically, what will happen is if you don't assign the user to this application, and if I enter this particular user's credentials in Azure AD login page, then it will throw an error saying I don't have access to this SAML application. So then you need to come back here and assign the user to this application. So I'm doing it before. So don't forget to do this step. Now let's go back to the users, and I will again go to SAML test user one, reset password. Yeah, I have this temporary password. So let's go back to the Cognito screen. And in order to test this, this hosted UI has a very handy link, which is available in the Cognito console. So you can copy that link. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use Mozilla for testing. And I have installed some plugins here like Cookie Manager, SAML Tracer to trace the flow, end-to-end flow. And SAML Tracer is one of the best plugins that you can use to learn the SAML federation. So my recommendation is to go ahead and install this plugin in Firefox browser so that you can easily track the SAML authentication requests and responses. So I copied the test URL from this Cognito screen, view hosted UI. I am just pasting it here and enter. So now Cognito displayed a login page. Since I selected both Cognito user pool directory as well as Azure AD directory, it is showing the login page where I can either enter the user credentials of a Cognito user pool, or I can click this button and that will initiate a SAML federation flow with Azure AD. So let's click this button. So now I got the Azure AD login page, which is basically the Microsoft login page. So if you look at the SAML tracer now, Cognito posted a SAML authentication request to Azure AD. And if you go back to this diagram, this is the step number 3. So what happened right now is I tried to access the app using the test URL in step number 1, and in the step number 2 that app actually redirected to Cognito. And when I clicked that button, the step number 3 happened, which is basically posting a SAML authentication request to Azure AD. So that's what you see here in the SAML tracer. Now I'm going to log in using the test user. So go back to Azure AD, copy this username, then enter it here, click next. So it asks for password. I copy this temporary password. So now it asks me to reset the password. I'm going to reset. Click sign in. Yeah, you can select this option. Ooh, something went wrong. Let's actually debug it now. So basically what happened was this SAML authentication was fine. And then when I tried to log in, there was something wrong with the Cognito. Mm, Maybe let's check what is wrong. So the SAML response got posted and I can see the email address, given name, name, and surname. And let me again click it. Let's see what happens. Oh, actually, it worked. I think there was some issue. I don't know what was the issue, to be frank. Maybe it's because of um the timing, right? So basically, like I clicked, then I had to reset the password, and maybe it took more time. I was explaining the blog in between. Maybe I took very long time before I actually changed the password and log in using Azure AD. And by the time the response got posted, uh, I'm guessing the request that Cognito sent timed out, and so it started throwing an error. So if you look at the response that is sent back to Cognito, so here is basically the request, the SAML authentication request, and then this is the SAML authentication response that is posted by Azure AD to Cognito, which is basically the step number 7. You can look at the list of attributes here that we configured in Azure AD, the email address, given name, name, and surname. And there are some other attributes as well. You can explore it later. But if you look at this ID token that got posted to this jwt.io, which is a sample client app in this case, and it will be some real web application in your case, you can check all the attributes here, like the user's name, family name, email address, and that should be a given name here. Yeah, given name. So now let's go back to the Cognito console and try accessing the user's screen. So you will see that same user created here in Cognito user pool with the prefix as Azure AD IDP. And this is the name that I gave when I configured the SAML Identity Provider in Cognito. So if you go to sign in experience, the identity provider name is Azure AD IDP, and that same prefix is added to this user profile which got created in Cognito. And this is what I explained here in step number 8. So basically, the profile gets created when the user logs in for the very first time. And you can check that exact same values here, like email, family name, given name, everything comes from Azure AD. And you can even see the identities array, which says the provider name is Azure AD. So basically what this identities array indicates is this profile was created using the Azure AD IDP's profile. So this profile was created based on the attributes that are posted by the Azure AD IDP, and the provider type is SAML, which is basically it was configured using SAML protocol. And the issuer here is the entity ID of the Azure AD IDP, which is basically the SAML IDP entity ID. So this is how you configure Azure AD as a SAML identity provider in AWS Cognito. So there are lots of steps involved here, and I agree it will be confusing. And if you miss out on one of these steps, for example, like when I go to this enterprise application, if you remember, I actually change these attributes and claim names by actually removing the namespace. So these are all some minor things in the configuration, but if you miss out, then you will see an error. You will get an error. And the easiest way to debug those type of errors is to use SAML tracer. So you can always see all the attributes that are posted from the identity provider to the service provider, which is Cognito in this case. And you can see the authentication request that is getting posted. So this is the easiest way to debug the SAML issues. You can track, you can look at the values here and then go back to the configuration and see if you have made any mistakes, and then you can correct it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post the questions in the comments and I will be happy to reply. I hope you enjoyed this video, and again, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.